Hello and welcome back to another week with me, Mr. Fowler, the Composition 1's course section 5005. Don't worry about missing my video. I'll zoom back in on that video in just a few moments, but I want to start today with some preview / review so that you can feel more acclimated as to what we're going to cover this week. First and foremost, it is midterm week. That's right. Out of the 16 weeks that we meet, one of which, of course, is finals week, this is the midterm, week 8. So I'll be updating the course grades and posting an additional announcement this week to let you know that everything is up to date and that you can be able to check your grades and see where you're at in the class. So far, everyone's doing relatively well. It may be the case that not everyone is doing as well as they'd wish, but you get what you give. So, for example, a few of you may be a little bit surprised to see that your scores in the weekly discussions have taken a little bit of a dip. That's because a few of you have not completed discussion from last week. I think just about everybody's chimed in for the week 7 discussion, but the week 6 discussion, a little light. So you may want to go back and double check that. I probably can't give you full point tribute to the greater discussion and to the highlight of the class. So be on the lookout for that material. Number 1, I hope some of you were able to complete the Kishwaukee College cert posted as a special announcement out this week. I up on Tuesday or Wednesday of last week. So if you used to do that, please and it really does make a difference in terms of how we can best suit not only you as a student, but your fellow students as well in terms of our course offerings and our modalities of offering, whether it be hybrid, online, like this class, or online sync where we meet to give us that feedback. Now, last week, we went through a PowerPoint presentation, catching you up. Specifically, we looked at chapters 12 and 13. This week, we will look at chapters 14, 15, and 16. And I will show you a student sample of our current project, the analysis essay. And that leads us into what I want to talk about right now. I shared this with you last week, so pardon me if this is a repeat, but this is why, again, we start each session with a review and preview. Now, again, quickly previewing, or in this case, reviewing this assignment, you see that it's worth about 26%. So essentially the same as the argument essay, all right? The benefit here, though, is it's a little bit shorter than the argument essay. Specifically, it is 850 words. Now, you can go over 850 words if you feel it's necessary to make your point and to clarify things for your readership. However, most of the time, 850 words should get the job done, which is about 3.5 pages, okay? So not too different from the 800, or excuse me, the 500 word essay that you wrote. Oh, just a little bit longer. We're going to evaluate this one at 100 points, and it's going to be due next Friday. Now, I'm recording this on Sunday. the 7th of March. So I'm calculating next Friday based on the fact that you may have had the entire week to read through or watch these videos and process this information. So 3:19 by 11:59 p.m. That will give me the break to grade the papers and give you back the results. And then we will also have a week left at the end of March to get our peer review done. Now, of course, you know from the last time that once we do our peer review, it's relatively up to you about in terms of how much time you want to dedicate to that revision process. But you'll still have the final week of March, which I believe is the 23rd through, or sorry, the 24th through the 29th or something like that of that month, which means the next week is when your final edition is due. And that falls on April 1st. That's not a trick. That's just how the calculations worked out. So that's due on the Friday of April 1st. Now, for those of you who do observe various religious holidays, that is the Friday before Easter. So you may want to get that in before the 1st so that there's no nothing stopping you from taking part in your celebrations and whatnot. So just be aware of that. Okay, that's all review material. And we're just going to quickly note, same aesthetic as last time in terms of the format, but with a new wrinkle. You're going to include one professional or one personal citation prepared in NLA format, which is going to require an in-text or parenthetical citation, as well as an additional word-cited page citation, which is separate from the 3.5 page or 850 word count for the essay. So again, what are we doing here? The world of Ready Player One contains a vast cornucopia of pop culture from the 80s. The world of the Oasis creator James Halliday's youth. And as we saw in the PowerPoint last time, that was part of his obsession, to create the game so that people could garner an appreciation for the things he enjoyed. Your task then is to develop a review or critical analysis, which is where the title of the assignment comes from, about a single piece of pop culture. It's a lot that's in there, but even in that fall asterisk last time. So it's in the book, it's fair game. So what I do is try this just that you would like to. Okay, so use something from the book. Connection to show from the period. Piece of wood oasis included because if there's something that you a topic for the kind of grandparent or guardians to enlist their expertise, give that sort of first-hand account of this particular object or item. Now, once you've selected that artifact, you'll write a review using these elements. You'll need to describe the artifact in question and develop some distinct criteria that you're going to use to evaluate. Then you'll subsequently go through each of those points of criteria, focusing on each of them as a specific paragraph, maybe pausing long enough to ask yourself what makes it essentially part of this era. You may want to also pause long enough to consider whether or not it really does appear in the book, and if it does, how it's interacted with. And then a little speculation. If you know you're going to select an object that doesn't come from the book or originate from the text, speculate on how the characters may have interacted with said object. And then lastly, a little personal bit of writing. Most of this will be apersonal, or it will be in the third person voice, but you may break into the first person for one paragraph or a couple of sentences in one paragraph just to explain why you chose that particular item as your focus. And then, of course, you will conclude with a specific idea that you want to focus on. Okay, so what does something like that look like? And that's a really good question. So I'm going to share with you a document by Anonymous here. She was a student in one of my former class sessions. This one from the fall of 2019. Seems like a long time ago now, but relatively recent in point of fact. And she decided to write about Dungeons and Dragons. Now, I've tried to bring this up casually, but I'm not the world's greatest Dungeons and Dragons authority. So this is pretty interesting from my perspective because it gave me a little bit of an insight as to why this was such an important element of the story in the novel. And she begins by writing that Dungeons and Dragons, otherwise known as D&D, was and still is a cultural phenomenon. This is due to the elements of fantasy, role-playing, and simple mathematics anyone can understand. You, along with a few friends, play through a fantasy adventure with characters that you create and act through. In other words, those are your avatars. You attack by rolling a multi-sided polyhedral dice and adding numbers to see if you can defeat the enemy or complete a specific action. The roll of a dice and your quick wits determines whether you live to see another fight or die by a mob of goblins. D&D is thought to be the launching point of, quote, of modern role-playing games and the role-playing game industry. And you can see here that in their very first paragraph, she has already tended to the one specific factor to this essay assignment, which is that she has a quotation. And I'm going to revisit that in just 1 second, okay? I'm going to highlight that for a moment. To explain, I will have to evaluate what makes D&D essentially 80s. Okay, what makes it essentially 80s? And I'm going to change that a little bit. Who created it? And its appearance in the novel, Ready Player One. So a number of important things are set forth here. She introduces the topic for review. And she gives the first piece of information, an official quote from someone named Dave Aronson. Notice that it is in parentheses. That's why a quotation is referred to as an in-text quotation, or a parenthetical within the parentheses citation. Now, notice that within the parentheses, there's also a quotation around the name Dave Aronson. So if I'm a reviewer or researcher and I'm trying to use this paper to build up my own sense of a particular subject, I'm going to go to what's called the Works Cited page. Notice that most of the time with a Works Cited page in MLA, the entries are going to be alphabetized by the last name of the author, or if there is no author to be found, as in the case of this Wikipedia citation, you name the subject of the encyclopedia or Wikipedia article. In this case, the name of the Wikipedia article is Dave Aronson. It's an article about him on Wikipedia. Wikipedia itself is not listed first. It's listed second, along with information about the fact that it's called Wikipedia and is sponsored by the Wikipedia Foundation. Next is the day, to the best recollection of the student author, that the information was accessed, because Wikipedia can be changed and edited or updated frequently. So it's best to find the date and day of the information from which the article is being referenced. So in this case, it was the 12th of September in 2019. And then the very last thing that follows the date is the web address, wikipedia.org in this case. You can see that she's got a couple of different citations. Most of them are from websites. And for a lot of the projects that you're going to be working on, you may find that a non-conventional web source is rather appropriate for the kinds of work that we're going to do here. Now, secondly, in this initial paragraph, going back here, she says that what I'm going to do to explain this is do three things. Explain what essentially makes it part of the 80s, who the creator was, and why and how it appears in the novel. So she names her three criteria. So each of these 3 points should, in some way, shape, or form, inform the paragraphs that follow. So the first thing she's going to do is explain what makes D&D essentially 80s. And she says, to begin with, it was first published in 1974, but this is only the date of its publication. It was quick to fall into controversy, though. Dungeons and Dragons first became widely popular in the early 80s when certain religious groups accused the game of Satanism and witchcraft. And we get not only a reference back to her first point, so she clearly identifies the path, the direction that this analysis is going to take. And then she also gives another quotation here to sort of build up the ideas, because most people probably aren't going to associate Dungeons and Dragons with the sort of satanic panic of the early 1980s, but it was a very real phenomenon that actually boosted the game's profile in society for negative reasons, perhaps, but nevertheless, in this case, at least, there was no such thing as bad press. Okay, so we move ahead here. Oops, there was a little comma splice that she had to correct. But now if we go back to this, who was the creator? Paragraph 2. The creator of Dungeons and Dragons, Gary Gygax, and his friend Dave Aronson, first met a gaming convention in the 60s called Gen Con. Aronson, already having made a game called Blackmore, showed his new friend, and in the years that followed, the pair developed the basic rules to what would become Dungeons and Dragons. So again, the focus of this paragraph controlled very well with an opening sentence that transitions into the focus of the creators of the game. Lastly, she said, what's the point of this in the novel? And she explains that in Ready Player One, Wade Watts is on a quest to find his own version of the Holy Grail, an Easter egg hidden in the code by the creator of the popular futuristic game called the Oasis. If he finds the egg, he shall be granted complete control over the Oasis, and to start his journey, he has to find the location of the copper key, the way to open the first gate and progress. The copper key is said to be hidden in the Tomb of Horrors, which is where Dungeons and Dragons is referenced. And she has a very good lead in here. Another good citation that needs to be slightly adjusted. Oops, one run on here. And then she concludes, Dungeons and Dragons allow people, and she says, she gets personal here, dropping into the first person, such as myself, to become more social and come out of their shells. And again, we have a nice closing here. So we're on right here, page 4 of 5. I said 3.5. And if you look at the word count down here, she's clearly made the word count without any sort of problem. And here's the additional works cited page. And I said, this is an excellent selection. I knew very little about it before I read the paper. And I learned something new. The main focus for the revision will be providing a final in-text citation, so on and so forth. Now, I didn't read every single element of the paper, but again, you could do much worse than use this as an example. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing that for a minute. And I'm going to move on to something completely different now. Specifically, I'm going to suggest that there may be a topic that you want to use or a source that you want to use such as this one. Okay. Something that works both for the MLA and the APA would be the personal communication. So you might not be able to find a readily available source such as Anonymous did, but you can use personal communications. There is usually referenced within a text or a note and rarely appear as bibliographical entries. So most of the time you don't want to use your personal communication as a source for an official paper. But if you do that, there are some examples provided for you here. Now, according to this person, Patricia Burns, what I remember most about Family Ties was Michael J. Fox. He was so funny, and the idea that a couple of hippies could raise a Republican conservative was interesting and a bit ridiculous. Now, notice that we quote the source here, Patricia Burns, and then we end with personal comment because there's no page or publication information necessary here to be included in the parenthetical or in-text citation. You could also just front load all of the information in the quotation and then in the parentheses include Burns' personal comment. Now for the first example, as in the second one, you could say, all right, Patricia Burns, comma, email message to author, comma, and the date the information was sent via email. Or you could say Patricia Burns, comma, said in context if it was spoken to you in person, comma, December 5th, 2017. Obviously, this example, the first one, could be changed to Zoom interview with author or Zoom discussion to best suit the needs of the individual instance that's being quoted. Now, whether it's APA, again, or MLA that you're working in, the personal citation is formatted thusly. Not a big deal, but again, if you can find better information, you should try to find better information. So next, we're going to introduce something that's a little silly, which is the quotation sandwich. Okay. Now the quotation sandwich, as this burger looking example suggests, is a method that you can use to practice quotations with. And there are three basic elements to a quote sandwich, which is to introduce it, to quote it, and to close it. But I want to give you a better example of what you may want to look at. Okay, so I'm going to share, and I'm going to go to this one, share. Okay. Here we go. So what does that mean? Number one, introduce it. Before you add a quotation to a paper, don't just plunk it down. So I can say, all right, that's done. Check that off my list of things to do for Mr. Fowler's assignment. No. Remember that you're writing under the auspices that this may be published someday. And you may have a readership with whom you cannot directly interact. So in that vein of thought, you should practice introducing the quotation. Try to focus it with a signal verb like argues or suggests or notes or something like that. What's referred to as a reporting verb. So in the article that we read for this week, the sound that defined the 80s music still lives on today, right? And I'll share that with you. We have a piece of writing published online by an author named Nick Loffer. It looks like laughter, but it's Nick Loffer. And this is an interesting idea, both in terms of the context of the novel, because 80s music is referenced throughout the book. And even in the introduction, Wade posits that it must have been strange for older people to see the songs that they grew up with and loved revisited and even remixed and subsequently remade as newer versions of the same sort of music. And this particular article is about a device called the AMS RMX16, which is a reverb effects unit that was invented in 81. And it's probably been used in songs that even you, as a younger group of readers, may have enjoyed. He mentions specifically a famous example from the period. Phil Collins is in the air tonight. And it's ethereal drums that the device created. But as the article points out, it's been ubiquitous or frequently used in pop music ever since. And they talk about the development of the technology and the man who built it, and so on and so forth. I'll let you read this yourselves. He focuses on other artists like U2, Rihanna, Radiohead, who all have used the RMX16 on very celebrated records. So the fact that it's still around and has now been recreated as a digital plugin for people to use sort of is testimony to its staying power as a sound and a device that originated from this era, the era in which the book Ready Player One is sort of obsessed. So going back to our quote sandwich example, in this case, you can say, writer Robin Lakoff argues, that's your reporting verb, that, and then you drop the quotation. Because after all, the quotation is the meat of the process, the meat of what it is you want to say to your reader. Robin Lakoff argues that, quote, cultural bias is built into the language we're allowed to speak about and the ways that we are spoken of, unquote, 152. Now, remember that in this case, you have a quotation that starts the sentence, and then you have a parentheses, you write the page number. You no longer need to use the P as an abbreviation for page. Just write the page number, 152. The quote is closed, and then, and only then, does the period show up to end the sentence. So it's, I like to remember it as open quote, close quote, parentheses, close parentheses, period. Parentheses, or sorry, quotation, parentheses, period. Quotation, parentheses, period. Remember that, because I'm sure that I'm going to have to correct a number of these, but I'm trying to tell you that it's not that difficult if you just remember quotation, parentheses, then period. It's going to be a lot easier. Now, lastly, before you completely exit the entire process, you should explain the quote. And this is what makes the difference between an excellent paper and a mediocre paper. Because once you've added in the quote, you shouldn't just drop the mic and walk away. You should explain why it's important. What do you think it means? How does it connect to the thesis that you're trying to drive at? And the explanation that you provide, by the way, should be at least as long, or in many cases, should be longer than the actual quote itself. So if we practice with this a little bit, and we look at this original blank, okay, and we hold on, and we use the blank. Did I use that correctly though? I want to share that. Okay, now I want to minimize this and share. Yeah, here we are. Let's say we thought this was really important. Built by audio engineer Mark Crabtree, the RMX-16 was light years ahead of its time in terms of flexibility and customization. Okay, that could be one good quotation that we could use. But I like this one. Peter Gabriel was Crabtree's first customers, and you would be hard pressed to find a major recording studio without once amongst their gear. Okay, and so we have to ask ourselves, who is the author here? Nick Laufer, all right? So we're going to share, and we're going to bring up the blank, okay? And we're going to introduce it, and we're going to say, according to author Nick Laufer, comma. So we've got according to, and then we're going to quote it. We're going to say, again, according to Nick Laufer, Control, paste, and then we have to make sure that it matches up aesthetically and get that to make sure it looks nice. Now, I want to be careful in my explanation here, because I don't know why this is, but a lot of students in the past have expressed some concerns about the action of cutting and pasting when they're making a quotation. Okay. Well, certainly I don't think it's okay at all. And I would not endorse someone simply cutting and pasting information for the purposes of a paper just to pass it off as your own work. But that's not what we're doing here, because we're going to explain that this is a distinction in terms of what we're doing right now. Okay, so according to Nick Laufer, now we know Laufer would be here, so there are a couple things we can do. We can say Laufer, comma, and then we'll drop the page number in, which let's find out, by the way, let's find out which one it was real quick. Okay, what page is that on? You can see right up here, we've got page numbers. Peter Gabriel was his let's see, where did that come from? Which page? There it is, his first customer. So this is page 2 right here of 4. So go back to our quotation sandwich, blank, okay, and we'll say 2. And then there is a period, because remember, it's quotation, close quotation. Oh, we got to make sure this is right frame. We want that to be times. Okay, so open quote, close quote, parentheses, period. You could, since you already named the author of the article, Nick Laufer, just get away with this, 2, because when we get to the works cited page, we will have a source citation for Nick Laufer's article. And then we close it, okay? So you can say that, whoop, that's a little big. Let's take it down to 12 here. This passage illustrates just how prolific the use of the RMX 16 was in the birth, sorry, of the sound that defined the 80s, period. Okay. So I just want to make sure you can all see that. Okay, so here is the, I don't know why this is happening. Please move this window away. Okay. Hold on. Mr. Fowler got a little technical issue here. Okay. Blank. That. And then share screen. Okay. So again, here you go. According to Nick Laufer, that's the top bun, so to speak. Then the meat of the source is the citation itself. And then finally, we've got the bottom bun, if you will, the explanation for how we're going to use this quotation in context for an example that we might create for the paper that we have been assigned. Okay. So I understand that there may be questions that arise in the next few days. And that's fine. That's to be expected. But that's why I'm going to be available to many of you. And while all of these materials will be present online. So I want to make sure my screen sharing is up. All right, so here we go. So to wrap things up, we're going to quickly update you on how things are transpiring in the text to sort of round out our midterm week. And here we have another parody poster, thanks to the busy denzians of the internet at this time parodying Beetlejuice. So chapter 14, IOI calling. Remember that at the end of chapter 13, Wade receives an invitation from Nolan Sorrento, the head of corporate IOI. And he accepts the invitation after he's done some homework about Nolan Sorrento and who he is and what he represents. This is This is particularly interesting because Nolan Sorrento, in many ways, is sort of the epic hero or epic villain in juxtaposition to Wade. So even though he is exactly what the novel depicts him as, sort of a corporate, tight ass who really is just interested in winning the competition so that his company can control the Oasis and maybe use it as a revenue source, Nolan Sorrento is also a very complicated character in terms of this mythic structure that the story employs. Having said that, this next bit may seem like Mr. Fowler's off his noggin, but I don't think so. I think Ernest Cline, despite how you may feel about his writing style, really is trying to tap into something akin to the Star Wars fervor, or the kind of yearning for this Joseph Campbell-like traditional structure for adventure and for a heroic narrative that functions in a way very few stories function today. We like to think of the world as more complicated, and it is a complicated world full of various shades of gray. But within that construct, there is still this yearning for a more classical narrative. And I think that's part of what Ernest Cline does well. Given that, hold on to your hat because this next bit gets a little bit strange. Okay. So he goes to meet Sorrento virtually at the IOI offices. And he opens up a chat link and appears inside, which of course is located on a planet dedicated to IOI's existence. It's what Wade refers to as the Sixer homeworld, a massive chrome globe, which reminded him of the Killer Spheres in the Phantasm films. This is an Oasis replica of the real IOI towers downtown in Columbus, Ohio, right? He asks. And the secretary of Sorrento confirms his beliefs. So this is important foreshadowing, which we'll get to in a few chapters. Now, specifically, Columbus, Ohio is quite important for what we're going to discuss in context of Ready Player One. It's important for a few reasons. Number one, Gregarious Simulations Systems, or GSS, is located in Columbus, Ohio, along with IOI. And the main Oasis server vault was located in Columbus as well. This has allowed Columbus, Ohio to reimagine itself as a kind of high-tech mecca in this dystopian future of 2045. In Columbus, quote, an Oasis user could get the fastest, most reliable connection to the simulation. Most Gunters dreamed of moving there someday, himself included. Again, heavy foreshadowing here. So, as chapter 12 ended, before we get into as chapter 13 ended, before we started chapter 14, rather, Wade says he felt like he was ready to sit down with the devil. And that's the first in a series of heavy-handed analogies that marks Sorrento as the big villain of the piece. First of all, his ID number for IOI is the same number of a character named Alex DeLarge, who is the criminal protagonist of A Clockwork Orange, another dystopian novel. And when he meets Nolan Sorrento, he first says, "At last," walking up grinning like a jackal. Jackals are often associated with evil, and specifically with the Egyptian god Anubis, who is a guardian of the dead and magical secrets. Very apropos, I would think, for a novel so concerned with the canon of mythology and fantasy. Is this an offer he can't refuse? And here, I think when Nolan Sorrento invites Wade to the highest floor of the IOI offices, a top floor 106, the 16th floor, the elevator door switched open, and I followed Sorrento past another receptionist and down a long, brightly lit corridor. I can't help but parallel the temptation of Jesus on the mountain, which comes to us from Matthew chapter 4, verse 7. And this isn't just me coming out of left field, because we've seen these same types of comparisons before. Anorak's Almanac in the book is the leading sort of gospel of the Oasis. And the only other texts that typically use chapter and verse structure would be religious books like the Torah, the Quran, or the Bible. And again, flashing back to chapter 13, Nolan Sorrento had been a decent coder back before he sold his soul, in which we get the echo effect of what Jesus says to the devil in Matthew book 4, verse 7. Man shall not live by bread alone, meaning that it takes faith to make your belief system work, right? You need to have a soul. You need to have more sustenance for your mind and your soul than simply food, simply the cash goods, if you will. And of course, we've seen the Easter egg hunt, and we've seen a comparison to the quest for the Holy Grail in other media. So what's the offer? Well, essentially, he says IOI wants to recruit you and to have you head up the oology department. And an oologist or oology is the study of eggs. And in this case, it's referring to the study of the virtual egg within the Oasis construct. And he says, you'll have all of our company's vast resources at your disposal, meaning you'll have the money, the weapons, the magic items, everything you need will be available. And Parsible's response is, what would be my title then? And he said, you would be called the chief oologist, in charge of the entire division, second in command only to Sorrento. In other words, hearkening back to that biblical passage, all you have to do is bow down to me, and I will give you the keys to the kingdom. So Wade rejects this, and he says, contrary to popular belief, the Oasis won't change. This is, Nolan Sorrento saying this, won't change when IOI takes control of it. Sure, we'll have to start charging everyone a monthly user fee rather than the 25 cents one-time only sign-on. And we'll have to increase the Sims advertising revenue. But we also plan to make a lot of improvements. Avatar content files, stricter construction guidelines, and make the Oasis a better place overall. Wade says, okay, with 3 conditions. I want a $50 million bonus when I find the egg for you guys instead of 25. I want your job, and I want to be in charge of the whole shebang, the chief of operations. But what is Sorrento's response? He says, sit down, Wade. And this is a cause for alarm, because Wade realizes that he had not given away his first name. As far as Sorrento was concerned, he was still Parzival. And Sorrento recognizes his hesitation. And he says, that's right. We know who you are, Wade Owen Watts, born August 12th, both parents deceased. And we know where you are, residing with your aunt in a trailer park located at 700 Portland Avenue in Oklahoma City. According to your surveillance team, our surveillance team rather, you were last seen entering your aunt's trailer 3 days ago and you haven't left since, which means you're still there right now. And as a consequence, they try to eliminate Wade. Unfortunately, he's not where they think he is, or not exactly. He's definitely in the stacks, but he's visiting Sorrento from the comfort of his hideout. He turns off the simulation, running to the stacks to try to save his aunt, but it erupts into a miasma of fire and twisted metal, and that's the end of his aunt's trailer. Basically, Sorrento kills Wade's family as well as several of the people living in his specific stack. This leads us into chapter 15. Wade says, okay, if things are going to get this dangerous, I may need some help. He seeks help from the other 4 members of the Gunter community who've completed the first challenge and earned the copper key. That would be, of course, H and Artemis, but also 2 new players, Shoto and Daito. And Wade asks his friend H, do you think they'll all agree to come? To which H responds, yeah, if we let them know their lives are depending on it. And we're going to have the world's top 5 Gunters together in one chat room. Who is going to sit that one out? So they all log on to the Oasis and specifically are sent links to meet up in the basement simulation that H has created. Daito and Shoto logged in, appearing simultaneously at the top of the staircase. Daito was the taller of the 2 and appeared to be in his late teens, where Shoto was a foot shorter and looked much younger, perhaps about 13. Every channel was airing Oasis footage showing the hordes of Sixer spacecraft and troops that were currently arriving on Ludus. Because after they discover the location of the copper key, they seal Ludus off so that the rest of the Sixers can earn as much money and positions high enough in the scoring tableau so that they're able to move ahead with the game. Artemis opened a video feed in front of her and spun it around so the rest of us could see. It showed, a wide shot of a flat top hill and the clearing around it, looking down from a spot in one of the trees high above. We could see the entire area was crawling with Sixers, and more seemed to be arriving every second. Shoto, interestingly, says that's not fair. And I have to say there's a certain naivete for someone who's so skilled at the hunt for the egg. However, I can forgive this because, again, he's described as being relatively young, perhaps just barely out of his teens. Or Daito, a little bit older, elaborates as well. They don't have to play fair. There are no laws in Oasis. And he even calls him little brother. So that means they have a real life connection, familial connection beyond the Oasis itself. Sixers can do whatever they please. They won't stop until someone stops them. But it turns out that someone won't be the high 5 because when Wade asks, would an alliance be such a terrible idea? Daito says it would. He and his brother hunt alone, much in the same fashion as Wade and H, who hunted alone previously. And he says, we don't want your help and you're strangers. After all, any one of you could be a Sixer spy, he points out. So Shoto and Daito refuse the offer. Artemis says, maybe that's what we should all do. And H says, well, yeah, she's kind of a lone wolf type as well. And Artemis doesn't argue that. Yeah, that's true. I am. But H counters with saying, if you found the Jade Key before us, are you going to be generous and tell us where it is? And Artemis says, of course not. So the collective sort of falls apart. But as each of them bails, H and Parzival are still together, dedicated to helping one another. And as such, they turn their attention to the riddle about where to find the gate for the Jade Key challenge. But as they do so, a stack of comic books on the other side of the room, this room being the basement simulation again, slid off the end table where they were piled and crashed into the floor as if something had knocked them over. H and I both jumped and then exchanged confused looks. So, could someone else be here? Wade asks, an invisible avatar eavesdropping on us? Well, they kind of dismiss this, or at least H does. He says that's probably just a glitch in the programming, although he admits he'd never seen one like that before. Then, just to be on the safe side, they decide to exit and they bump fists like the Wonder Twins, which gives us another classic late 70s, early 80s reference, a pop culture reference. This leads us, of course, into level 1, chapter 16, the final component of level 1, which is the aftermath. Wade begins this chapter by exploring the scoreboard just to double check and see how well he had been doing. And of course, the last 5 slots now belong to the IOI goons. Like I said before, Ludus itself has been invaded, becoming the most popular destination in the Oasis. The public school board saw the writing on the wall, and the decision was quickly made to evacuate Ludus and relocate its new schools on a different planet. A copy called Ludus 2, which was created in the same sector, a short distance away from the original. Meanwhile, in the kind of eBay frenzy, clans had decided to break out the heavy artillery, pooling their resources and purchasing 2 very expensive, powerful antimatter bombs. The first bomb took down the outer shield, and the second bomb finished the job. The moment the second force field went down, thousands of gunners, unharmed by the blast, of course, due to the no PvP zone in place on Ludus, swarmed into the tomb and clogged the corridors of the dungeon below. So they're trying to go to war with IOI to make sure that they're not the only ones who are able to advance. Meanwhile, we discover that IOI has manipulated the media and has suggested that the explosion in the stacks was simply due to a meth lab that was illegally being ran out of the stacks. And here we see, of course, reference to popular media again in the form of Heisenberg from Breaking Bad. So again, media manipulation. Throughout time, the media has often been used by the very powerful, aka IOI, to embellish a story or its outcome. There's another popular example from media. That leads Wade to a road trip. So he says they just left the wreckage where it was in the stacks slowly to rust into the earth. So Wade uses some of his resources and catches a double-decker bus. And interestingly, we get to see the sort of erosion of the American landscape, sort of chaos that's taken over in the wake of any sort of normalcy and the sort of governmental collapse. The bus is described as being a double-decker, fully plated with armor and bulletproof windows, as well as some solar panels on the roof for a fuel source. A team of 6 heavily armed guards rode on the bus's upper deck to protect the vehicle and its passengers in the event of a hijacking by road agents or scavengers. Again, we get a sort of a parallel take on a popular culture piece like the Road Warrior, sort of indirectly referenced here. But due to the deteriorating interstate system and countless stops the bus had to make, it took several days for him to reach his final destination. And he says there were plenty of desperate and corrupt people working for the government and every major corporation. And these people often sold information on the Oasis black market, which is an important foreshadowing point. Specifically, Wade sets up a false identity named Bryce Lynch, right? He's 22 years old, issued a new birth certificate, and all of this comes courtesy of the Oasis black market. He's able to set himself up with an excellent credit report, a Bachelor of Science degree in computer science, and he also is able to clone his fingerprints and retinal pattern so that he can operate autonomously as Bryce Lynch and make a little extra money on the side while he's waiting to discover the truth behind the final clue. So essentially, Wade makes the move from Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, to Columbus, Ohio, again referenced earlier in this section. And that sort of wraps up the first level of the novel, the first 16 chapters. He does secure a new apartment there, and I will end with some questions for your consideration. My apartment, he writes, was on the 42nd floor. The security lock mounted outside required another retinal scan, and then the door slid open and the interior light switched on. No furniture in the cube-shaped room and only one window. I stepped inside, closed the door, and locked it behind me. Then I made a silent vow not to go outside again until I completed my quest. We'll see how well that works out for him. I would abandon the real world altogether until I found the egg. But is that a rational choice or even a good one? Why is it that he doesn't want to go outside anymore? So again, we'll have the opportunity to pursue Wade's future as we move into level 2 in the second half of the semester. Now, level 2 is quite short. So this week, don't forget to start reading, if you haven't done so already, chapters 17 to 19. I'm also going to make sure I upload the new link to the audiobook so that if you don't have the text, you're going to be able to finish the reading, listening to the links on the audiobook. All right, that's it for week 8. Like I said, I'll be in contact later this week with an additional update announcement to tell you when you can double check your grades, and I'll be updating those as well. Until next time, this is Mr. Fowler, encouraging you to think critically, to keep reading, and to make the most out of every day. Take care, everyone.